Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
This week on the podcast, we wanted to tackle a topic that has been requested multiple times, and that is the topic of porn. My joke this week has been that if we do this correctly, we'll have people angry at us from both sides of the issue because we're going to really try to hold the tension of the opposites. And it is a very polarizing topic. We're being guided this week in particular by a really wonderful book called Lost Goddesses, A Kaleidoscope on Porn by the Jungian analyst Giorgio Tricarico, and we will put that link to that book in the show notes. So we're going to try to walk all the way around this topic. We're going to try to hold an analytic attitude and explore the many facets of this phenomenally important topic.
Yes, and a ubiquitous topic. I'm grabbing onto your word about how polarizing it is. And it is. There's a fascination, seduction, excitement, pleasure, and there's addiction, disgust, moral issues, and more. And all of these sides of the polarity are pretty powerful words, concepts, and feelings. So the polarization is intense.
I think one of the challenges that we can expect in our conversation today also is that there are so many dimensions, and we could do a series of podcasts on pornography, the production of pornography, how quote unquote actors and actresses are secured for these things is very controversial and often times tragic, how it affects young people versus older people, men versus women. There's all kinds of nuance in this. Some of those elements are more tragic and troubling than other elements. It's our first brush,
Yes.
so to speak,
Yeah.
around this topic, and we are exploring it much in the way that we hope that you will, without a sense of absolute certainty, because there is a mystery around anything that captures the collective. That the ego can take its own multiple stances towards it, but there are also very strange unconscious forces that are at play that are very difficult to discern. But I think our title of the book that we were referencing earlier has to do with the lost goddess, that there is a primordial dynamic that is carrying a kind of drumbeat in the collective and commanding an enormous amount of tension.
So let's just start off by saying that, Joseph, you were talking about how this has captured the collective. Porn is an enormous industry. Porn sites like Pornhub are routinely one of the top visited websites. And I think it's difficult to overestimate the reach of porn, particularly available on the internet. One of the things that Tricarico does a really good job of is linking porn with the rise of technology. He says it's essentially a technological product, that there's always been erotica that's as old as humanity. But the ability to produce an image, to take a photograph when cameras were first introduced, in forms that are increasingly easy to duplicate and disseminate. And now we have the internet, and it has really shifted the way that porn is consumed, how easily it can be consumed. The average child comes across porn these days at the age of 9. It's absolutely ubiquitous. And, if you're not a porn consumer, if you're a porn consumer, you know this. If you're not a porn consumer, you may be surprised to know how much is out there and how easily it's accessed and how many people partake of it. Mm-hmm. So this is just a huge aspect of our culture.
So I'm grabbing onto your words, Lisa, that it's a product, it's marketable. And isn't that interesting that porn is a product? It's a thing. It's not a relationship. It's something that can be marketed and sold and advertised. And that's what we're doing, is merchandising through the power of various images on, let's say, the internet, of sexual stuff as a product, a consumer item. And I think that in itself is really very interesting, that erotica is as old as humanity. What marketing and advertising and image can now bring to the public gives it a whole new dimension. Porn may not be different in kind and in itself, but it sure is different in degree, thanks to technology and advertising.
Erotic images have been around for thousands of years. There are
yes.
Friezes and mosaics that are found in ancient ruins depicting various kind of sexual behaviors, so that we can suspect that human beings, their brains and nervous systems, have responded to, I want to say, is kind of disaffected images of sexuality. That the image itself, which is only an effigy, just a symbol of an act, has enough power to light up the nervous system and the brain, and to provide a certain kind of experience of sexual arousal. And what we're talking around today is the incredible potency that the state of sexual arousal brings, and how central that is to being human. And when one finds various ways of achieving that intense arousal, we are designed to want to keep coming back to that stimulus.
Just to anchor this discussion a little bit, I have up on my screen these images. If you Google brothel in Pompeii and then choose images, the brothels in Pompeii were decorated with these images of men and women, in sort of sumptuous poses, having sex. And so there it is, these erotic images that you were talking about, Joseph, and how they act on the nervous system. And then what happens when market forces get a hold of our nervous system? I mean, one of the things that I think that Tricarico does really well is he says something to the effect that our culture was pornified before porn. And by that, he's really talking to this mindset of consumerism that he spends a great deal of time on. And I think he does it rather brilliantly. I'm going to just read a couple of quotes. He says, having something compels one not only to use it, but to need it. In the end, one does not have what is useful, but what is imposed. So the way I think we can all relate to this, the point of the market is to create needs that we didn't know we had. That's kind of what advertising does. He continues, the need is essentially produced by the product itself, together with a massive influence of advertisement and marketing.
Yeah.
He says porn is subject to the same dynamics as any other product, including a possible addictive quality that compels consumers to spend more and more time surfing on porn websites, looking for the ultimate fragment of unfulfillable desire. And this sense of unfulfillable desire is the very nature of our technological consumerist society that we just take for granted at this point. And it exists not only in porn, but as Trikariko is at pains to point out, with everything. So I thought that was a really interesting frame to place on this and a really interesting place to start.
That really resonates with me, what you said about how the culture has been pornified in a lot of ways. Lest we think about the sex industry as, some kind of one singular, extreme. It's part of a whole culture. And he talks about how he was walking down the street with his very young child, and the child saw a plush animal in a store window that had very large eyes and wanted it. And he said, no, like many parents do, walking down the street with our kids, no, you cannot have that. No, we're not going in there. And then later on, the son was still distraught about, how much he wanted this animal and desired it. And he went back the next day and bought one for each kid. And I think that's a good example of the pornification, as he says, of the culture. And I think we all know about marketing to kids of all kinds of products.
One of the interesting things about that story was that the plush animal had these very big eyes, which talk about sort of jacking into your nervous system. There's something very archaic about our response to eyes, and in particular, preternaturally large eyes, which the offspring of species have. That's what makes a puppy cute or a kitten cute, is part of what makes them so cute is they have really big eyes. So there's something sort of primordial about a child's response to a plush animal with big eyes. And somehow the manufacturers, either consciously or unconsciously, know that.
I find myself also thinking about times I've been in stores and when a child has attached a desire to an object and then mom or dad says, no, you can't have that. The incredible eruption of rage and frustration and tears and tantruming, that once the brain has decided this is the object and has imbued it with incredible potency, and then the parents are trying to demonstrate, reasonably so, the ability to contain that instinctive hunger, you can see this huge tumult that a child has to go through over and over again to be able to tolerate saying no to something.
So we're really sort of circling around here, sort of our inherent human physiology, our nervous systems, are just who we are as humans, that we can easily be stimulated to want something. Something that is beautiful, something that is soft, something that gives us power, something exciting, something that promises, freedom or beauty. It's not hard to create those wants and then turn them into needs. And I think, certainly we are sexual creatures. And so as we grow up from children wanting a plush animal with great big eyes, certainly we have biological wiring that attracts us to sexual objects, people, acts of all kinds. And that need, too, is easily stimulated. And we're hardwired for sexuality.
And following from that, I'm just going to follow the path that Trikharika lays for us, because he goes on from discussing sort of the nature of a consumerist society to talking about this phenomenon that he refers to as an omnipotent mentality. And this relates to porn in a couple of very direct ways, as I think you'll see in a minute. I mean, for one thing, an omnipotent mentality is built into capitalism, right? It's this fantasy of infinite growth. And there's always this sense, the basic message of advertising, Trikharika says, is that you can have anything is possible. There's a sort of a repression of limits. So there's this sense of unboundedness. And one of the ways that this happens in porn is quite literally, there are sort of no limits to what can be expressed, to what can be desired.
So there's the actual product in terms of the scenarios that are filmed.
Right.
But I think Trikara also really lays at our feet the idea that the entire world has changed so that everything is at our disposal. So whether and I'm guilty of this, whether I'm clicking on buttons and I get, 15 Amazon boxes at my door.
Yes.
I can't bother to go down to the store and search around for something now.
Yeah.
Because in 2 seconds, this, that, and everything else just shows up. So there's a huge zeitgeist of everything being at our disposal. And that's extended, of course, to the idea of sexual arousal being at our disposal as well. So one of the reasons it's difficult sometimes to create some boundaries around pornography is that we are constantly reinforced by the idea that nothing is out of our reach.
Right. It's available to us 24/7 with a click of the button. Much of it is free. There are these, sites that host professional porn, but there's also a lot of amateur porn. Anyone can take an iPhone and film themselves and upload it. And my understanding is that there's a lot of amateur porn hosted on various sites. There's also this new phenomenon of OnlyFans, where individuals can create an account and upload images and films of themselves and then charge subscribers to have access to those images. A lot of young women are apparently opening OnlyFans accounts. So it's everywhere. It's constantly accessible. It's available to anyone, both to produce or to consume.
And I have to say, young men are also opening these accounts. I think pornography that highlights men on men's sex and male-female sex are equally prolific all over the internet. And it begs a question, which I don't have, I think, enough information about at the moment, is what is the fantasy that is in that young person as they are setting up this account?
Mm-hmm.
Because unlike other times in history where somebody might have been groomed or invited into a kind of sexual situation, here you have young people without any prompting deciding that they will seek out this situation for themselves because they imagine any number of things. And what's coming in my mind is they're imagining how other people will be sexually excited by them.
Mm-hmm.
And that has a huge impact on people's sense of self, their self-esteem, their own sense of sexual power over others, as well as creating funds for themselves. There's probably many other dimensions to that when people self-produce their own material without prompting.
To be desired as well as have desire.
Mm-hmm.
Seems to me those are just heads and tails of that particular coin. And to have that power of being desirable.
Mm-hmm. Joseph, this is a great question. And this is one of those areas where if we we're going to have to work hard to hold the analytic attitude.
Exactly.
Because I can certainly feel within myself a judgment about it and a real concern for these young women who are making themselves vulnerable in this way. I mean, these images can be downloaded, they can be shared, they're never going away. They're on the internet forever. So what are you doing? This kind of maternal, no. And it feels exploitative, that these young women don't know any better and they're being taken in. The other half of it is that many people would say that it's really empowering, that it's a way for a young woman to take charge of her sexuality, or young man, taking your point, Joseph. But I'll stick with young woman just for the sake of simplicity. To take charge of her sexuality, to make money. I mean, some people make a lot of money on something like OnlyFans. And of course, this applies to porn in general, too. There are some women for whom it feels like a very empowering claiming of their sexuality. And Deb, the point that you brought up of the power of being desired. And I think there's probably truth all around. I think it could be potentially empowering. I think it could also be potentially exploitative. And truth may not be so easy to land on.
And desire in and of itself has its own archetypal life, which is why in many pantheons there are goddesses or gods of desire in and of itself. For many of us, we equate desire and love and partnering and mating are all woven together. But I think in the ancient world, there was a little bit more of a clean differentiation. The desire is its own spirit. And men and women in our culture work tirelessly, particularly when they're younger, to be desired and to be desirable. In our Greco-Roman pantheon, which influences American society particularly, Aphrodite, Venus, is the goddess of love and the goddess of desire. And one of her children, Priapus, is the god with a constant, enormous erection. So this power of desire, whether it's harnessed to marketing any object under the sun, or specifically put into marketing pornography, is something that we can't transcend, although there are many attempts to attack desire. In our culture, we equate desire with often demonic, irreligious impulses, that the fantasy that we should be ascetic and pure, that, for instance, sex should only be performed for procreation, but not for pleasure, is an old religious value. And being raised as a Roman Catholic, that's a line that I had heard. My friends, even now, that are involved in some ashrams, travel to India, this same sense that a life that is devoid of desire is somehow preferable. And what that does is it pushes those ancient gods and goddesses into the unconscious, so that desire becomes a kind of rumbling under the ground all the time and everywhere, waiting to be awakened. And nowadays, we can think it's laughable to look at some 1950s Cadillac ad where you have a scantily clad woman reclining on the hood of the car. But in less sophisticated times, that connection between this ancient goddess of desire and her proximity to any other object allows that patina of desire to then be spread onto the other object. So then all of a sudden, buying a Cadillac means that the same thing as having an incredibly beautiful lover, or that it's going to attract such a person to me. So the gods and goddesses of desire keep coming back, in part because we keep attacking them in the culture.
Mm-hmm. That's such a wonderful pointing of your inner compass, sort of toward the divine. and the divine or goddess aspect of desire. And that's the title of this book, is Lost Goddesses, of where is the divine. But as we know, religious instinct and sexual desire, any archetypal kind of image has a light side and a bright side. It has the divine and its other darker side. And certainly without a container, pornography can veer very easily into a dark realm as well. There is a science fiction writer, Philip Dick, who has a wonderful quote that I'm going to read about this, that when the divine has been exiled from the table of serious art and intellectual discussion, you have to find it in what elite culture thinks of as trash. So I'm thinking about what is the deeper cultural implication of such widespread porn and the porn industry and the pornification of culture. Where is the divine in all of this? What has been lost? That it's not erotic, it's not, Greek temples and well-managed expression of desire. What are we going to look for here in the trash?
Well, I think that that's beautifully said, Deb. And anything that we banish into the unconscious becomes more primitive, it becomes less elegant, it takes on other underworld qualities to it. And the more we make it conscious, the more we can transform it into a kind of conscious art form. And we can imagine that sex exists very much in that realm. If we were in a culture that welcomed and celebrated sexuality, the beauty of the body, the joy of sexual arousal, we would have a much more sophisticated and nuanced relationship to it, which would, in a sense, vaccinate us against it going underground and then growling at us from all of these unexpected places.
But Joseph, I'm going to just push into that a little bit, because I don't think that our culture is particularly sexually repressed, particularly compared with previous generations. So the fact that porn is everywhere and is kind of normalized in some sense is, one could argue that it is an indicative of the fact that we do have a conscious relationship with sex. I think it's more that we've lost the frame that would give it its sacredness. And so it's become desacralized. So it is in and of itself a numinous thing that is close to the divine. But we no longer have a cultural frame to place it there. And so it eats away at us. Sexuality does. It can possess us. And then sometimes it can possess us in very dark ways. And partly, I think it's because it's lost its sacred framing.
Well, I think that we as Jungians understand the sacralization of sex in a particular way. I think that's quite different from the way that various religions, exoteric religions, have characterized sex. So in a conventional, let's say, Christian framework, sex is kind of stripped of desire and becomes a functional way of having babies. But as Jungians, when we talk about the sacralization of sex, what we're talking about is a full and deep psychological experience of sexuality. So, for instance, two people are involved in a sexual act, what we would, I guess it would be funny to say in a Jungian way, but let's just go there, that there would be attention to the psychological nuance about it. People would be tracking their inner experience, and that would be part of the dance of physicality that brings into it. And in a wonderfully intimate relationship, that might even be discussed as part of the lovemaking.
Or just even the pristine joy of the body, just this sort of embodied sensuality that could just be celebrated and be seen as the act could be in service to the god or in service to the goddess of just enjoying that.
To the incarnation of this ancient reality.
That is what used to happen in the ancient Greek temples. It is that the sexual act would be dedicated to a god or goddess of that third element that is sacred. And that is something that we are in service to. There is something transcendent that we are in service to, enacting a sexual act in all of its physical pleasures. And that is what has become so desacralized in today's world with the ubiquity of porn. It's anything but a sacred, sensual celebration of two people's bodies uniting.
So I think we've done a good job, and I think very importantly, talking about a certain vision of sacralized sexuality that is full of psyche as well as the joy of the body. And when we hold that, and then we imagine, let's say, a young man watching his computer, and he's telling himself, oh, I'm having a sexual experience because I'm looking at something. There's such an enormous disparity between those experiences. You know, for instance, when one is watching pornography, the eye is the primary sexual organ.
Mm-hmm.
No one is touching you other than yourself. There is no scent of the other person. There's no real sound of their voice in a way that's very full. There's no psychological reality of the other person, nor them being interested in that part of you. That it's really this very tiny part of sexuality. I mean, it is a sexual experience, but it's so truncated and so small.
Yeah.
And when it becomes the primary, or perhaps for some people, the only way that they're engaging some form of sexual arousal, they may not even know what they don't know. They don't even know that there's 90% of other dimensions in this experience, which isn't happening when you're watching a screen.
And Joseph, this gets us into a really controversial but interesting area that I feel like you have a lot to say on. I'm thinking, I mean, some people talk about porn addiction. Some people who use porn will describe themselves as being addicted. Meanwhile, there are many scientists who say that that concept doesn't actually hold any water and that it's destructive to think about it in terms of addiction. But I'm wondering, I know you've worked with many young men who are heavy porn users, and I'm wondering if you could just speak from your experience in that regard.
I think addiction in general, if we're going to characterize something as an addiction, has certain components to it that would need to be present. One is that the ego is not able to regulate the behavior. And that's just one very clear distinction. So whether it's eating a gallon of ice cream a day, despite the fact that I have diabetes and makes me sick, but my ego can't limit that substance. Or, as I see in my practice, you know, there's some young men, and by young I mean in their 20s, who might be spending 20 to 30 hours a week watching pornography and involved in some form of physical self-stimulation, to the degree that it's interfering with their ability to develop other interests, whether that's dating or getting another college degree or furthering themselves in one way or another, that the pornographic addiction claims too much of the real estate of someone's life. Chronic debting, shopping. If somebody tells me I spend 30 hours a week shopping on the internet, and I spend every spare dime I have and have maxed out every credit card, it's the same criteria of the ego is captured by something. And just in terms of human freedom as a goal, which is one way of talking about individuation, we have to be suspicious about any objects that seem to prevent us from being free. So that's one criteria that I will listen for when somebody is discussing their porn use. The other area that concerns me is where the object of the addiction then replaces other higher functioning behaviors. So, one of the things which really is an epidemic is that young people that have been watching porn for 15 years are now in a social sphere. They're trying to date and they're trying to connect sexually with partners and finding themselves awkward, frightened of the physicality of a living human being with them, not being sure how to behave or wanting to rely on the theatrics of a pornographic scene to inform how to be sexually intimate with another human being, and discovering that the other human being doesn't always really like the stuff that we've been seeing online. And they're not howling in pleasure, that what we saw online was theater. It really wasn't about how human bodies respond. So there can be a tremendous bias against taking the step into the physical world, into the real world relationships. And that's a real unintended consequence of this, which can be a problem. And by the time somebody is 25, 35, approaching 40, and they still haven't had a gratifying sexual encounter with a human being.
And you've seen that
Absolutely.
more than a couple of times.
Then human sex or sex with another human being becomes a kind of chimera. It becomes this strange, frightening, mythic creature that slips out of their hands to great agony for them, by the way. So in that way, the pornography becomes a kind of phantom lover. You know, if you think about that happening to one of your adult children, it's heartbreaking. You wouldn't want that for your kid. You'd want them to be out there with people. So that's a concern, which has nothing to do with morality, by the way. It has to do with functionality.
Right. And of course, it bears saying again, and trying to hold both poles here, that is not the fate that befalls all users of porn by any stretch. I don't have any idea what the numbers are, but I think it's true that the vast majority of men are regular porn users, and probably most of them use it in a way that just enhances their life in some way. So, you know, I don't want to paint a picture that it's always pathological, but it's important to remember that it can be.
Yes, and we were just talking about those rare instances where somebody gets caught up and they can't walk away.
And right, and by the way, I'm using the word pathological there just to mean something that is maladaptive.
And it's preventing us from blossoming into a greater fullness. So coming back to porn, just in and of itself, and just wondering about what is it that the human psyche sees in the pornographic stagings that is so compelling? What is it, either archetypally or in other ways, that are happening in these scenarios that are lighting up people's bodies and psyches to such a great degree? What's our understanding of that?
So may I answer with a quote from our book? He says, "My hypothesis is that the widespread fascination for porn may represent a sort of unconscious nostalgia for the sacred and the divine. In an epoch like ours, when all the previous frames of meaning, mythological, religious, metaphysical, have waned, and when the gap between the death of God on a collective level and the acute need of meaning on the individual level becomes painfully felt, albeit not clearly acknowledged on a conscious plane."
So let's unpack that.
Well, if you'll indulge me here, that goes back to the Philip Dick quote of that when the divine has been exiled from serious discussion and, let's say, just meaning and centrality in a culture, then it gets degraded and goes into what we think of as trash. Notice that Dick does not say
it is trash.
It is trash. He
Right.
says what we think of as trash.
So there's something numinous.
We are looking for something numinous, something limitless. And that is what people have historically written about and found in experiences of the divine, of something that is transporting, something that is all engulfing, of these epiphanies. And so it's an interesting thought here that he is expressing in this book, a nostalgia for the divine, for the numinous.
Now, if we again were to look at American culture, which is predominantly Christian and has a male patriarchal God image, and the goddess is missing. I mean, I think that the Roman Catholic Church tried to capture that in the veneration of Mary, but particularly stripped her of all sexuality.
Yeah, she was a virgin.
She was a virgin. She was producing babies without the need for that pesky sexual stuff, which everybody is supposed to lock away. And even just from some of the archaeologic artifacts that we come across, that in cultures where female versions of God, the goddess was more present, images of sexuality and sensuality and reproduction and fertility were much more ubiquitous in the culture, that it was part of the known psychological and spiritual life of a people. Whenever something is banished, again, it grows increasingly more potent and feels more dangerous. So when we think about this relationship between God as exclusively male and the need to control women, because the goddess is unconsciously projected onto women, which makes them seem overpotent and dangerous in some regard. But all of a sudden you have cultures that are telling women what they can and cannot wear, how much of their skin is allowed to be exposed, the jobs they're allowed to have, or are they sequestered only at home? And I believe this is in direct proportion to whether or not the goddess is acknowledged as a psychological fact. So given that we're unlikely to revert to some Babylonian goddess worshipping in the United States, at least in the current seeming of things, what do we do about the lost goddess? Which men, by the way, spend an awful lot of time looking for. When I talk to men, and I talk to them very openly about their pornographic use, and we go into great detail because I think that there is also a kind of existential loneliness in this use of pornography, that they are searching for something. And if we imagine there's a 4-hour time period that somebody is dedicated to using porn, I would imagine, based on what I hear, is that at least half or more of that time is spent in seeking.
Yes.
One after another after another. And they're scrutinizing and often clicking away, saying, oh, no, it's not that one. That's not the one. That's not the one. That's not the one. Which suggests somewhere in the back of their psyche, there is an image of the one.
Mm-hmm.
And they're looking for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to what you were saying, Deb, that is the image of the divine goddess.
Except I have to put in here, I agree with what you've said and the seeking, but that is inherent in marketing, is you never want to fulfill your customer's desire or they'll go away and stop buying your product. There is a difference, I think, that I want to explore a little bit between the seeking and the lost goddess and what seems to be the fact that it can't be found in porn because it's repetitive and we come back to an area and activity, images, engagement that is never fully satisfied. And that seems to me, kind of a heartbreaking dynamic.
Well, if what you're looking for essentially, and I think this is what we're saying, is that at some degree, what motivates this is a search for connection with the divine, with some kind of communion with something larger.
Mm-hmm.
You might have a fleeting taste of it in a masturbatory moment, but really that deeper need goes unfulfilled.
Yes.
There isn't an adequate dimensionality to the experience. And when we imagine having a sexual or religious experience, we could imagine that if we just put our mind to a sexual experience we've had recently, and we were to be able to add an incredible dimension of feeling, an experience of ecstasy, an experience that one is connected to something infinitely larger than oneself for a period of time, and that the other is supernaturally beautiful and perfect in some way, that those tremendous depth of intensity and feeling are the things that we're craving, and that masturbating in front of a laptop simply does not provide. But as you had said, Deb, it beckons as if it could.
Yes.
If you just spent a few more hours, if you just tried these several different scenarios, because there's all kinds of different fetishizations that are happening in different kinds of pornography. And so the search then begins to move towards larger and larger and more provocative kinds of sexuality, because I think there is an error that we as human beings fall into, that any kind of arousal, if it is combined with sexual intensity, will somehow bring us to a more heightened state of sexual excitement and release. So it's not just an image, let's say, of intercourse. It's intercourse and it involves incest, or it's intercourse and it involves betrayal with the plumber who you call to fix your sink while your husband's not around, or it involves, having sex
with an amputee,
or
with someone dressed as a puppy,
as a puppy, or in a public place, or involving violence or urine or feces or strange clothing or five people at once. And so the brain responds, particularly initially, with a certain amount of kind of shock and maybe even a certain amount of disgust the first time we brush against certain themes. But that heightened sense of alarm that the brain generates when that is mixed with a state of what might be normal or even slightly flaccid sexual tension creates a bit of a firestorm that we mistake for an improved sexual excitation.
And Turcarico talks about this because he talks about when you come across something really shocking, that there's a haunting quality to it, that you can't stop thinking about it. And that's true whether it's like a porn image or a sexual image or just like an image of horrible violence or something, and it's true. You come across something like that and it kind of grips you. But when this works its way into sexuality, and Joseph, I agree with you about this, it sort of heightens the experience. There's a way that the upper end of this keeps moving forward, and our appetites needing something to be more and more extreme because we kind of acclimate to it. And that's why there's the sense of the transgressive in porn, that which is transgressive creates this heightened experience, but then we get used to it and we need something more transgressive. And it's this area that really there are no boundaries. So there are no boundaries to transgress. I mean, it does make me wonder, where's the upper limit to this? And I think,
or the lower limit.
Yeah. Just for example, right now, what's very popular on porn sites is incest porn, and it's brother-sister porn, it's mother-son porn, there's a lot of father-daughter porn, and it's just sort of ubiquitous. which initially maybe it makes you think, ew. But then perhaps there's that fascination, and it becomes your brain is sort of led down that pathway. And a little bit, I do wonder about porn shaping our desires.
Mhm.
So I hear more and more that young people, and Joseph, this goes to what you were saying, kind of having their first sexual experience after having been exposed to a lot of porn. I think that young women now just sort of expect that choking will be part of things because that's a very common scenario in porn. And I mean that may be, really exciting to some people, but it might not be for everyone. But we've been sort of conditioned, as it were, to find that a turn on, or at least some of us have been. And other people are like, really, I've got to do that. So I do wonder about how porn is perhaps shaping our appetites.
Absolutely. Something that might have been interesting to a very small subsection of the culture now, because of its availability through media, internet media, is something that very large swaths of the population now are kind of saturated with and normalizes it.
Right. And not even just available, but like, if you can imagine, like maybe the first time you saw choking porn, you thought, well, that's weird. But somehow there was something exciting about it. So you keep on coming back to it, and you've watched hours and hours and hours of it when you're in a sort of suggestible state, because you're in a sort of trance-like state while you're masturbating. Then you there's been some entrainment happening where this is now what you associate with, heightened sexual pleasure.
And particularly because sexuality is part of it. So if a person is watching people having intercourse, there's a sense of pleasure and intensity, and which is arousing to watch as well. And then into that crucible of primary sexual imagery, the choking is introduced, then the state of sexuality becomes associated with the choking, or certain kinds of clothing. I mean, why do some men fetishize high heels or stockings or a brassiere, for instance? And by linking together primary sexual images, erections and roused vulvas, once the brain is lit up with those images, anything else that's ancillary takes on the patina of arousal. And just as you said, by reinforcing that over and over again, the brain comes to associate it. And this was part of Jung's discovery around the complex, is if we take an archetype, let's say the archetype of coition, of intercourse, and we wrap that in thousands of images of choking or certain kinds of clothing or language, using kind of sadistic or masochistic language during the act. Once the complex is woven in with those various things, and that activates all of those images and memories, activate simultaneously, again, taking away any kind of moralism around it, but just being curious about how the human psyche responds to repeated exposure to experiences, and then to ask, more importantly, is this indigenous to me? Is this who I really am? And I respect that some people that I've worked with said, I've thought about it for a long time, and this really is true to me.
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
Yeah.
I mean, okay.
Right.
But the difficulty is that most people don't ask that question, or they don't ask it long enough to really penetrate the truth around it, no pun intended.
Well, I think I just want to speak also to, some of these images that just been talking about, of choking and various other kinds of things that, if we had someone in our consulting room who, to use an example you brought up earlier, Joseph, was eating a gallon of ice cream every day. I mean, I don't think we would, simply discuss it as a neutral topic. I mean, it's clearly not good to eat a gallon of ice cream every day. Some of these things I would posit, it's not good to have this kind of obsession, addiction, and to be entrained by images that are obviously hurtful, such as choking someone. I do really very much relate a lot of this to the lost goddess, something that could be sacred, a sensual, celebratory, full on wonderful sexual experience with another person that's embodied and human, and connecting it to the pornification of culture, as Tricario says. Step back, take a look, and ask that question that you just put out there, Joseph. Is this who I really am?
I want to follow up on what you're saying, Deb, because I feel like maybe we've skirted this, and this is the point at which some people are probably going to be upset with me. But I think, we have to talk about the sort of the human cost of producing this pornography. And so much of it involves violence, some of which is pretty extreme, and it may partly be theatrical, but I think that it's pretty obvious that while some women in the porn industry may find it very empowering, it is not usually a woman's first choice. And the women that wind up in porn often may come from circumstances where this was maybe the only way out. For example, there's a lot of Eastern European women back in the 90s who wound up in the sex industry because they came from, kind of economically disadvantaged circumstances. So, this isn't like you dream of your kid being a porn star because it's a wonderful lifestyle. There's a lot about it that is difficult, that's potentially degrading. And honestly, some of these women are physically hurt doing this and have to suffer at a very minimum physical pain, sometimes of an extreme kind. And so I am not personally, I'm sharing here, of the camp that wants to celebrate this unthinkingly. And I don't know that I believe that it's a sort of a neutral thing at all. They're saying, I suppose that's a very kind of personal reflection, but I did want to get that out there.
One of the things that reminds me of is this reality principle that you're bringing in, Lisa, is that often when people are addicted to pornography, that there is a lack of consideration for the humanity of the actors and actresses, and that part of beginning to create some breathing room around the addiction is really thinking about these living human beings and moving from this kind of visual, two-dimensional relationship to the images and the body arousal to a three-dimensional, a much more rich fantasy of who these people really are. And so in my own practice, I will often have clients bring in their laptops and they'll show me the kinds of things that they're obsessing about with pornography. And we'll watch a minute or two of it and then we'll stop. And then we'll talk about what do we think is really happening? Like when the camera shuts off and these two people are over there on the set, what do you think they're talking about? What do you think they're feeling? What do you think is going on in their bodies? What do you think they do when they go home?
Right.
Or how did they get to this moment? And sometimes with a little bit of internet typing, some of the porn stars have a lot of information about themselves online. People are surprised to find out, oh, this woman is a mother of 4 kids. She lives in Pasadena, or
yeah.
then now that's not very sexy for some people to know, but it's also a reality principle. It's like that's part of what you're observing. You can still choose to observe it, but we're trying to move into the humanity of what's happening.
So great, Joseph. You're talking about this kind of fantasy collapses.
Yeah. And I'm relating it to you bringing in the idea of a complex. As Jung says, we can have part personalities when a complex takes over. And this kind of work enlarges it. Don't limit yourself simply to one part personality. Become more whole. What about these people as whole people? What do you think they're feeling? Maybe she lives in Pasadena and has several children. it's a movement toward becoming more whole. And that is an inherent value, not just unique to Jungian psychology, but unique to becoming all that we really humanly can aspire to be and have full, multifaceted lives.
Mm-hmm. I do want to just circle back. I know that we're finishing up soon. Just returning a little bit to some of the fantasies that draw people to watching pornography. And there are a couple of things, again, our new favorite author has brought forward that I think bear speaking. One is the desire for multiplicity,
Mm-hmm.
that human beings are wired to be very sexually curious about each other, male and female, that's part of being a creature, being an animal, a mammal. So one of the ways that our desire for multiplicity manifests is it goes underground and comes back in our fantasies. We'll fantasize about what it would be like to be sexual with various people. Pornography allows us to have this experience of multiplicity with much more specificity. We have the chance to see many people who are unclothed and to then evaluate whether or not we would be attracted to them or whether or not it's something that we might choose to participate in. But we can fantasize that we've had multiple partners when we watch multiple people being sexual in front of us. That's also a way of coping with monogamy for some people. Another thing that is worth consideration is that we don't live in a culture that celebrates the joy of the physical body, that the senses produce a tremendous amount of pleasure. And we have varying relationships to it. Some of us are well connected to our natural hedonism, that we prefer delicious food and we won't really tolerate bland food, or we really need to have fabrics and furniture that feels delicious to sit in, although other people might not. But the body is a pleasure producing phenomena, in that when somebody is masturbating and they're watching pornography, I think that they are trying to find a joy in their own physical body that they don't seem to be able to find in other environments. And I think there's some truth to that. Even if we have a physical lover, it doesn't necessarily mean that our lover is evoking or taking great joy in our bodies, for that matter. Sex is often kind of hurried and intense, and it's somewhat fraught with ambivalence because of all kinds of things. And I find this even with young couples, that it takes a lot of work and thought to make the sexual encounter between partners as full and open and joyous and multidimensional as it could be. And that most of us may not even know that that's possible, but I think we are seeking it when we're watching pornography. And then the last bit, again, which our author brings forward, has to do with where we put our own destructive aspects. That we all, every single one of us as human beings, have a kind of primary narcissism that's built on the will to power. And whether or not we're watching pornography that weaves sexual excitement with domination of one kind or another, and by the way, most men have fantasies of being sexually dominated as well as being the dominator. We're drawn to many images. If we look at the movies that show up on your Netflix account, how many images of murder and mayhem and apocalyptic destruction and AK-47s delivering rounds of bullets everywhere under the sun. I mean, I've become somewhat numb to it because it shows up in action movies constantly. But one of the things that we're trying to reach for is some way to engage these powerful destructive fantasies that are woven into our human nature. And we can find that in pornography as well, as we were talking about pornography that involves any kind of pain or violence, whether it's choking or hitting or tying up, all the variations of it. That something inside of us want visual representations of our own darkness, and we are compelled by them. We want to stop. We want to see them so that ostensibly we can think about them, which the Freudians called mentalization. And you can't think about something that doesn't have an imagistic representation.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up so many important points, and it takes me right into the realm of shadow, which we haven't even really spoken about today, but clearly we've been speaking about it the whole time too.
Yes, indeed. I am just sort of struggling to say something that about shadow. And I think, Joseph, you just hit on it, of the imagistic representation of something that is dark, so that we can step back from it and think about it and bring it into consciousness. And that is very much, in a way, if we could do that, that is the work of individuation. We do shadow work all the time. And that's the task for all of us in any kinds of ways, is to come into an experience one way or another of, where is our vulnerability? Where is our greed? Where is our will to power? Where is our desire to be brutal and to inflict pain? If those are human aspects that we all have, the key feature here is to bring those shadow aspects into consciousness so that we don't have to be enslaved to acting them out. And it is, for people that have heavy porn usage, it really can be a kind of enslavement, which is actually the definition of addiction comes from addictus, which is delivered as a slave to someone. So I'm just thinking that this could be an effort to integrate shadow that can be lifted up into consciousness and perhaps turned to what we as Jungians think of as the very good purpose of individuation.
That we need to be full human beings.
Yes.
And when we can't find our way to our fullness, then we are attracted to proxies of our fullness. And one thing that I would finish with is that pornography is a proxy. It's a proxy for the viewer being loved and for pleasure. But most importantly, it's a proxy for the goddess. It's a proxy for Ishtar and Aphrodite and Inanna and Green Tara and Hathor and Isis. It's a proxy for these banished, exalted images of the archetypal feminine that I believe the culture craves, and most importantly, men crave. And we don't have an easy cultural way to understand that at that archetypal level. And so Jung said that the symptom is the psyche's best possible response to a psychological problem in a given moment. So if we think about excessive use of pornography or the ubiquitous use of pornography, it is the best way for the cultural psyche to be in relationship to something around sexuality and the feminine. But it doesn't tell us what would be better. And that's up to us and our creativity to be able to get a sense of what's the next step that would be better than the 20 hours of pornography I'm watching a week.
That's really perfect, Joseph, and perhaps a good place to finish.
Hey, Lisa, what's been going on about your book?
Well, as you know, my book, Motherhood, Facing and Finding Yourself, was published in May of 2021 by Sounds True. And since it's been published, I've been feeling most excited and grateful reading the reviews for the book on Amazon and Goodreads. It makes me realize that this journey, which began as a challenging personal inquiry for me, has become a real healing force for many. Motherhood won the Parenting and Family category of the Best Book Awards this year through the American Book Fest, which has been exciting too. But what really feels nourishing to me as an author is hearing what's happening on the ground in people's hearts. And so many people have written to me in email or on social media and let me know how much the book has meant to them. And there's just nothing more gratifying than that, than to hear that the book has meant so much to so many people. So Motherhood is available wherever books are sold in paperback, ebook, and audio formats. And I hope everyone who's meant to dive into the well of its lessons can do so. And I so appreciate hearing from people what they think of it. So keep the emails and the letters and the comments coming. They mean a lot to me. There's also a free course that's related to the book and a book excerpt on my author website, which is lisamarciano.com. And I encourage all of our listeners to check it out. So thank you for asking, Joseph.
I'm just so happy for you. And it's such a lovely, lovely book, both deep and accessible, about the inner journey around being a mother. It's never been written about. It hasn't been out there. And it's getting such an enthusiastic, heartfelt reception. It's wonderful.
Yeah. I would love it if listeners who've read the book could write a review on Amazon, because although there are many wonderful ones there, more is always better. So thanks in advance for that.
You've really incarnated something that was in the ethers, but needed to be pulled down, needed to be shaped in words, and needed to be made accessible. Mm-hmm. And the proof in the pudding is that it's beginning to have a kind of life of its own in the collective.
Yes.
And that speaks a lot to the timeliness of this.
Yeah, I think you're right, Joseph.
The analogy to a baby is just too rich and too good and too multifaceted to be missed. It's having a life of its own, which is just what we want.
That's right. So before we switch to a dream, I just want to remind all of our listeners that you can submit your dream for possible interpretation of the podcast. Just go to our website, thisjungianlife.com, and you'll see a button right at the top of the page that says, "Let us interpret your dream." Just click on that button and send us your dream. This week's dream comes to us from a 46-year-old woman who works as a teacher. And here is the dream. The dragon queen, a young blonde woman, was not the rightful queen and needed to be tamed. Everyone said to throw her in the furnace, but I couldn't do that to her. She had become a sort of friend and had come to trust me. I came to her through a room where archery practice was taking place, a cave to the kingdom. An old friend was a centaur, and he was teaching me to shoot the bow and arrow. He had many tiny arrows, which he shot into the queen's cave and missed. She came out and said, "Let me show you how it's done." I then captured her by tackling her with a black sheet. Then I sat on her and started massaging her legs vigorously. She started to relax. I then went to her arms and belly. She completely relaxed. Then I uncovered her, and she was ready to learn how to live in our society. One of the guys in the archery group took on the job of teaching her how to eat. He showed her a vision of all kinds of foods and nutrition, but he started with feeding her only sweets, all kinds of candy. I was worried and said so. He said that because she was a dragon, we needed to start out feeding her that way. So, for context, she notes, I'm currently in a career transition and trying to envision what my next move is. And the feelings in the dream were worry, concern, love, and purpose.
So this seems to be a rather archetypal telling of My Fair Lady.
Okay, say more.
Where they've found this primal dragon queen, and they have to subject her to this refining process so that she can then become a true member of society and a fine person, and all of that. It goes back to the old Ethiopian story of the Queen of Sheba's hairy legs and how she's civilized by Solomon. Henry Higgins is civilizing Eliza Doolittle. Absolutely. And all the variations of this, that the wild dragon queen, the feminine that is overly associated with the transpersonal, requires something in order to be mediated and become humanized, and therefore something that the dreamer can relate to. And I find it interesting that touch is the magic thing, that it's massage that allows this part of her own psyche, or this archetype for that matter, to relax enough to then be brought into a kind of civil discourse with the ego.
It's a wonderful progression here from a dragon queen with all this power. And then the next is she meets centaurs, who are famously raucous, wild creatures, half horse, half human. So that's her first encounter with the other, a male, with the bow and arrows and shooting her down, which doesn't work. And then the massage, which is, the touch, as you already mentioned. And then finally, feeding her sweets, of the sweetness of life. Something good, something appealing. This charming end of the dream here, because she was a dragon. We needed to start out feeding her that way. And I would be curious about, how some of this is alive in her life, and where that sweetness is versus feeling embattled. Where's her dragon self, and what needs to come into a new attitude, a new way of being and feeling in the world?
This dream reminded me of this Irish fairy tale that Sharon Blackie tells in her book, If Women Rose Rooted. And I know I've spoken about this tale before on the podcast, and Sharon very, very, very kindly wrote and told me that I butchered the names. And I'm going to do that again, because I don't remember how to pronounce it. But so it's the story of, I know I've got the name wrong, but I'm just going to call her Mies. It's Mis. So if you're Irish and you know how that should really be pronounced, you can write into the podcast and let us know. But she was the daughter of a king, and after a battle, she went looking for her father, whom she loved dearly, and she found his decapitated corpse stretched out on the sand. And she was so overwhelmed with grief that she staggered to her feet and wailed and clawed. I'm reading from Sharon's book now. She wailed and clawed at her ravaged wet face and her blood-stained clothing, and in her agony of despair, she was taken by madness, rose up in the air like a bird, and flew away to the heart of the mountains. And there she lived like a wild woman. She had feathers and fur covering her naked skin, and she grew great sharp claws that she attacked and tore to pieces any creature or person that she met. And she could run like the wind. She had sort of superhuman powers. And finally, there came a man whose name I also would get terribly wrong if I tried to pronounce it, so I won't. But he goes to her and he tries to win her back. And he sets off with his harp and he goes to her lair, and he lays out gold and silver coins, and then he lays himself down in the cloak and begins to strum his harp. And then she kind of comes out, and she's there, part hag, part wolf, barely recognizable as human. He uncovers himself so that his genitals are exposed, and that kind of entices her further toward them. And then eventually he says, why won't you come and sit with me for a while? And she does, and gradually in this way she's humanized. So some part of the psyche that's gotten monstrous, dragon-like, exiled in our fairy tale, it's because of grief, that the contact with the human part has been temporarily disconnected. For this dreamer, I'm not sure why the dragon queen is a dragon queen. How did she wind up in her cave? How did she get exiled? I don't know that we know, but the fairy tale makes me wonder about grief.
Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about the other Irish tale about the famous warrior whose name I not only couldn't pronounce but can't remember, came back from battle and had to be soothed and tamed and sort of through rituals, basically rehumanized. So I'm thinking trauma and battle and grief dehumanize us and turn us into, for example, dragons. And we're back on the topic of our favorite topic, shadow. Of what is this about? I would be so curious. I love your idea of how did she get to be a dragon? What is that about?
She's not the rightful queen, and she needs to be tamed. And it's interesting that she is tamed through sensuality. It's a little bit
Yes.
like the Irish story, that it's touch. She's rubbing her arms and belly. It's a great dream too, in the sense that initially there's this sort of antagonism toward this content, right? They're aiming arrows at her. That then she has to be kind of loved. She has to be loved back into integration.
And that's the theme in the story that you related a bit. And it's a theme of warriors returning from these battles, of to be loved and touched and then welcomed back lovingly into a community. So I'm curious about, what her social, relational, familial, friendship, where is that for her? Of people who reach out and touch in ways that are emotional, which is depicted here as physical.
Yeah, it says everyone said to throw her in the furnace, but I couldn't do that to her. She had become a sort of friend and had come to trust me. This is some part of the psyche that's been devalued, but importantly, the dream ego values it or has some relationship with it. Doesn't want to just discard it, even though that's what everyone says to do.
Perhaps discard, but also purify. That the dragon queen, if she is contaminated with the dragon archetype, might need to have that separated out or cleansed so that that excessive archetypal energy is no longer pressing upon her. Because I think that when these mythic figures get very active in our psyches, it can be very inspiring, but also it can wreak a lot of havoc. So the purification by fire or the taming through touch and human contact and teaching one how to eat, etc. Both of them, I think, have a similar intentionality, although the second seems more like the way that you would raise a child or an infant. So once the dragon queen is subdued, then she is raised as if she is, a toddler and being taught how to conduct herself. So it is possible that it is a very, very young part of her own psyche that had been cordoned off, perhaps because of early trauma. And there's an opportunity now for her to reclaim something that had been split off like a complex and to humanize it. And often we will imagine these inner children and try to imagine caring for them as a way of symbolizing this maturational process that we may have missed because of some problem.
And really, the only context we have is that she's going through a career transition. So, in terms of kind of reclaiming these inner children, I wonder what content, what old content that's now being restored, and how that might relate to her next step. She's gotten back in touch with something, perhaps, that will now find expression.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.